All right. So we're in this series, How Not to Be Your Own Worst Enemy. Did anybody experience that this last week, where you were your own worst enemy? Anybody, right? So, last week we talked about paying attention to the tension, right? We talked about how important it was when you start to feel this tension that's happening in a situation that you need to stop and pause. Pay attention to what is happening to the tension. So this week, here's the one thing this week. And it's this. Pay attention to your self-talk. Pay attention to your self-talk. Or you could say, pay attention to your narrative. Okay, a narrative is the story, right? The story that we tell ourselves. It's the story we tell ourselves and the world around us. All right? Yeah, that's called a narrative. That's called our self-talk. And how some of those stories, if we believe them, it's going to cause us to become our own worst enemy. If we go there. And the truth is that we become who we think. Okay, this guy named Solomon in the Old Testament, wisest man that ever lived, he says, as you think, so you are. What's happening up here determines what you do right here. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so there's this whole thing as far as what this narrative that we attach ourselves to can actually cause us to become our own worst enemy. Okay? Think about the times when you've had these conversations with yourself. Okay? Ever have a conversation with yourself? Yeah. You know, maybe even today, right after you woke up, you started to have a conversation with yourself. Right? And maybe it was about talking to somebody that you had a conversation with. You were thinking about this conversation you had with somebody, right? Or maybe it was about your boss. Or maybe it was a fellow employee or your husband or a wife or a friend. And you start having these conversations. Sometimes we have 2 and 3 conversations going on at once. Right? Right? And we have these conversations because of regardless of what took place, we, at the bottom of our hearts, we're just like, we just don't want to think that the conversation was random. We don't like this. There's this part of us that there's this thing, it's like this cannot be random. Like, there has to be a reason why this takes place. Like, that's just ingrained in us. And when you think about things that take place and these conversations and circumstances and all of those things, it's like there's this part of our being where it's like, no. There has to be a purpose. I can't live my life in random. I need to know that there's a purpose. And so we create these narratives that cause us to think about purpose rather than having something random. We want to attribute reason and effect. There's got to be a reason and there's an effect on why this is. We want things to make sense, don't we? It's inside of us. It's ingrained in us. Okay? So we tend to create a narrative, a story, this self-talk that helps us make sense of what's taking place. There was a lot of that taking place during COVID, wasn't there? Yeah. Like, it was rampant. Everybody was trying to make sense of what was going on. And the worse the situation is, the harder we work at it. Right? What happens is we create these narratives or these self-imposed stories about what's taking place, right? And many times these self-imposed stories or these narratives are not accurate. I mean, it's these narratives that can cause us to become our own worst enemy. Our current culture is a narrative creation factory. It is like, you think about Fox News, CNN, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, right? Right? Yeah, my Instagram account got hacked again. Okay, I am done with Instagram. I'm not even doing it anymore, right? And people started getting all these texts about these great deals from the government from some grants or something, some government grants or whatever. Yeah, really, you think? And so I often think, okay, listen, I often think it makes me ask the question, who are you being discipled by? Who are you being discipled by? Because you know what the reality is? You're being discipled by somebody. And you're creating these narratives by somebody. And it doesn't have to be another Christ follower. You're being discipled by somebody that's creating narratives inside, right? So when I was growing up, okay, so and this actually starts at a very early age, right? How we do this? Okay, when I was growing up, I had this intense belief in Santa Claus. Like, it was intense. Like, I watched every Christmas special that I could that had Santa in it. Every single one, right? I made cookies. I left them out. I put the carrots out there for the reindeer. Like, I tried to stay up secretly so I could see Santa, but I always fell asleep, right? Okay, and our radio station, now listen, okay, our radio station back then, okay, would break into regular programming on Christmas Eve with a general from the Air Force who would come on and say, we interrupt this regularly scheduled program because we are tracking a UFO that is traveling at tremendous speed. And we have been tracking them through Iowa and Nebraska. And so I would just keep listening, he would be reinforcing this thing to where I'm like, I can't wait, he's going to get to our state. He's going to get to our state. He's right there. See? I told you. Right? This is all true. I told you that. And I knew what it was. It was Santa. Right? I knew that. And no one on earth was going to convince me otherwise. Like, there was no one on earth that was going to convince me otherwise. Like I had created this narrative in me, right? That Santa had a way to hide realities from those that doubted. So even when I had other kids come up and go, oh, you know what? Dude, Santa's not real. Do you know what? It didn't faze me at all. Do you know what I was thinking in the back of my mind? Well, that's because you're doubting. And because you're doubting, guess what? Santa's not coming to your house, dude. Right? He only comes to houses of people that believe. Right? How about when you were a kid? How about when you were a kid and you thought how stupid school was? What a waste of time, right? This is stupid. This is such a waste of time to go to school. Right? This is so stupid. Right? Right? And you would like never think about the fact that you were using electronics that were actually made by somebody that went to school. Right? Right? Maybe you even had an electronic device that your stupid parents bought you. Right? Because they had gone to school and now they have a job and they can, but you're like, school is stupid. Right? And then you start to grow older and you start to go, crap, why didn't I finish school? Because my narrative back then was wrong. I needed school, right? Okay, here's another one. How about how dumb you thought your parents were growing up? Anybody have that kind of thing going on, right? Oh my gosh, you're so stupid. You're so out of it. Right? Oh my gosh. You just don't understand. Right? There's that. And how they were, you're such a loser. Right? So out of touch, man. Right? And you built this narrative and convinced yourself about how stupid your parents were, and then you started to get older. And you started to experience life. And all of a sudden, your parents got smarter and smarter and smarter. And you're like, until you realized how wrong that narrative was. It was wrong. Right? I mean, these are funny examples, right, of what we do. But sometimes our narratives create things that we can't even hardly even talk about. Right? Like these narratives that we created caused us to become our own worst enemy, and then that caused irreparable damage. Families are destroyed. Jobs are lost. Relationships are blown up. Friendships end. Financial stability is just blown to crap. Right? Because see, there's this direct connection between our narratives and us becoming our own worst enemy. Narratives are really powerful. Yes, they are. They're extremely powerful. Internal false narratives, oh my gosh, they fuel our pride and our racism and our self-righteousness and our prejudice and our fear. And it blinds us to our interdependency on each other. That we need each other. And so our narratives are shaped by how we experience the world around us, right? And how we grow up. How we're treated growing up. It's the filter that we use during those experiences, sometimes just to survive. Right? So my narrative while I was growing up was that I was somehow damaged. Like I had that narrative from birth. That everyone else around me had all their pieces to the puzzle in the right places. And I thought my pieces were missing or misshaped. I really thought that when God made me, that he just ran out of stuff and he substituted broken pieces and put them wherever he could. And I carried that narrative throughout my childhood. I had this picture of me. My uncle was really into black and white photography, okay? Like he would make these huge blow-up photographs, like huge things, right? And so one time he took a picture of me when I was, I think, 9 years old. And I remember when I was growing up, like even after Kelly and I, when we first got married, I couldn't look at that picture. because it represented a narrative that I had about who I was. And so, as time goes on, I absolutely hated that picture. Hated it. And I lived with that for almost 30 years. That narrative. I had become my own worst enemy in many ways from that narrative. And it wasn't until after Kelly and I got married and I decided to go to counseling to start untying those knots with truth that I began to experience freedom from that narrative. So we're going to look at this place where Paul is writing to a group of Christians in Corinth. And so he's writing them this letter because these group of Christ followers in this big church, there were a number of them that were starting to embrace some very toxic narratives. And so Paul, he never minced words. He never sugar-coated anything. And so he's going to use some very visceral language as he's going to talk about this. So he's writing this group of people. We're going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. We'll get you a Bible, but they'll be on the screen here. So, and some of their narratives that they were struggling with were from the past, and some were from those around them who were trying to destroy their freedom in Christ. And they were basically saying, yeah, you know Jesus, but we need to talk about Jesus plus. Right? And so Paul is going to use some military terms because he knows false narratives is a war. All right, so listen to what he says, starting in verse 3 of 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Listen to what he says. He says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. Though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." And so Paul begins at the very beginning by validating the fact that we're all living in this world together. Okay, we are together in this world. Which means all of us, as we're living in this world, we all have this intense desire to know that we're loved, that we have significance, that we have purpose. Everybody does. We're born with that. Right? But we live in a world that is incredibly broken. And so we all have these scars and these gashes and this stuff, every one of us, that we carry with us, right? So we're in this together, right? We're in this together. No matter your background, your color, your race, your sex, your education, married, single again, we all live in this world. Somehow, we need to embrace it. But the things we've chosen to believe, our internal narratives, have caused us to be at war. It's caused us to be at war. This world can be messy, it can be unfair, it can be hurtful. But as a Christ follower, we're not supposed to fight this war like our culture does. There's a different way that God calls us to fight this war, okay? Listen to verse 4. He says, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. Lying, revenge, manipulation, racism, prejudice, that kind of stuff. He goes, no. That's the world's way of doing that. We're called to something different. Yeah. He says, on the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. So he's saying, okay, these weapons that we're going to use, they actually have the power to change our narratives, to actually crush our narratives. Okay? He uses the word strongholds. See this right here? Strongholds? You know what those are? Those are narratives. Yeah. This is what you believe. This is your self-talk. This is your story. This is what holds you fast. Strongholds are narratives, okay? And he says, like these strongholds, those narratives that we created can cause us to become our own worst enemy. It's those conclusions that we draw based on our narratives. Okay? Verse 5, listen to this. He goes, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedience to Christ. Okay, this word right here, demolish, this is an intense Greek word. This means to destroy with violence. This is an intense word. Because Paul knows the incredible damage that is done when we decide that we're going to live our lives based on our narratives that we have, wherever they've come from. We're going to actually live our lives that way. Okay, so Paul is saying today, okay, this is what he's saying. He's saying that if we're going to destroy any of these narratives, right, there's this contrast to how a Christ follower should be living their lives. As a Christ follower, like he's saying, as a Christ follower, the way you're going to deal with this is going to be different than the world, how they're going to deal with it. We're supposed to be set apart. We're supposed to do this a different way. And it says, how a person is destined for the kingdom should be defining their narrative. Like if you're a Christ follower, guess what? You should be finding a way to define your narrative based on truth. Based on truth. Right? And then he says, take every thought you have about the world and bend it or shape it into what Christ calls us to as Christ followers. Take that thought, bend it into what Jesus says, into what Jesus tells us we're supposed to do as Christ followers. Right? Change it into the vision and the values that Jesus taught in the Gospels. In fact, you know what the Gospels do? The Gospels give us a glimpse into what the kingdom of God would be like if Jesus' followers would embrace what he said. Yeah. Like, you want to get a picture on what the kingdom is like? Read through the Gospels. And you read through how Jesus interacted with people. Read how he did it. Right? Like, have you ever had this conversation with God? Like, have you ever asked God, just tell me how you really feel about people, and maybe I'll change my narrative. Just let me know, how do you really feel about people? How do you look at them? Maybe I'll change. Just reveal to me how you want people to live, especially those that love you. Could you just let me know how to do that? And if I could see people the way you see people, like if I could see them the way that you see them, I might be more inclined to change my narrative. Okay, well, Philip actually asked Jesus that same question. This was right before Jesus was about to get arrested. And then everything ramped up from there. Right? Right before he was going to get arrested and be beaten and be crucified and murdered on a cross, right before all that was going to happen, listen to what Philip asks in John 14, verse 8. He says this. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father and we will be satisfied. Just show us God. Like, if I could just see God, if I could just understand where he's coming from and how he feels about me and how he feels about the world and how he feels about other people and how I should treat other people and how I should think about the future and how I should think about the past. If you would just show me God, it would change everything. And then Jesus responds. Listen to what he says. John 14, verse 9, Jesus replied, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still don't know who I am? Like, Philip, you've been with me for 3 years. You've lived with me. You've seen me interact with people. You've seen me interact with people that aren't following me. You've seen me interact with these religious nuts out there who think they're following God and they're not. You've seen me talk to prostitutes and tax collectors and all these people that nobody else wants to be around. You have seen me do that, right? Then he says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Let that sink in. He says, anyone that has seen me has seen the Father. So why are you asking me to show him to you? That's why reading the 4 Gospels is so important. I tell people this all the time. You want to know what God is like? Read the Gospels. Look at Jesus. Do you want to know how God deals with sinful people who think they're disqualified from God? Read the Gospels. Read about Jesus. Do you want to know how God feels about actually providing for you and helping you to escape the nuttiness in this world? Read the Gospels. Read what Jesus said. Jesus says things like, seek me first and my kingdom, and all of these things will be added on to you. You got needs? Seek me first. Yeah. Jesus says things like, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. Anyone that comes to me, anyone, Jesus modeled what the kingdom looks like when, as a Christ follower, we take what he says seriously.
Yes, we
do. He shows us seriously. And when we let him shape our narratives and not the culture around us, things change. So I just want you to think about, okay, for a second, I just want you to think about why you do what you do. Why you don't do certain things you don't do. I just want you to think about that and how they're connected to your narrative. Okay? So I'm just going to throw some questions out. Okay, these are just random questions that maybe will help you start thinking about this. Okay, just random questions. Why don't you call your sister? Why don't you call your brother? Why do you drink so much? And why do you get so pissed off when somebody else gets in and talks to you about your drinking problem? Why do you let that other person treat you so badly? Why do you keep doing that? Why won't you call your dad? Why don't you call your mom? Why did you move in with him or her? Why'd you do that? Why did you file for divorce? Why did you let him take advantage of you again? What do you tell yourself about why you despise Republicans or Democrats or rich people or poor people or white people or black people or immigrants? What do you tell yourself that made you give up on God and give up on the church? Right? I guarantee you, when you look back on your life and you were your own worst enemy, and you made your worst decisions, you had a supporting narrative to do that. So let's talk about Paul's advice. Okay? Remember, I'm going to say we're always going to do a commitment at the end of each one of these. Okay, here's the commitment that Paul gave us. Okay? I didn't have to come up with this. He already had it. Here's the commitment to these narratives, and it's this. Demolish every argument and thought that sets itself up against what you're learning about God. Demolish every argument and thought that sets itself up against what you're learning about God. Whatever you're learning. We're all at different places, aren't we, in our relationship with God? Some of us are just starting to come back to God. Some of us have been in a church for a while. Some of us are kind of questioning whatever it is. But whatever you're learning, that's a key part of this narrative. Second part of this, Paul says to take captive those arguments and thoughts and replace them with the truth of God's word. We just talked about this morning in men's Bible study. Yeah. It's like this is like we need to know what this says, because we are so easily deceived. If you don't know what this says, there are a lot of with all the social media that's out there, you can go anywhere, and there are people out there that sound very spiritual and very smart, and they're loading us with a crock of crap. And people are falling for it. Hook, line, and sinker. And do you know what these two things are? You know what this is? We talk about following Jesus. Okay. This is following Jesus. That's what this is. See, Being a Christ follower isn't defined by the fact that you believe something. Being a Christ follower means you are being defined by a person, and his name is Jesus. That's what that means. So that's what God's calling us to here. Because I know in my own life, when I'm just doing my own, making those decisions, making those how I'm viewing people, based on these other narratives or whatever, I become a slave. I am enslaved. And sometimes we're enslaved and we don't even know it. We don't even know it, and we are. And yet when we put our faith in Christ and his Spirit comes to live inside of us, as Paul says, we're not going to wage war like the world does anymore. That's over. It doesn't work. But Paul says there is a way that can crush these strongholds in your life. Absolutely demolish them. So think about those questions, right? Do some soul searching with some of those questions, all right? Okay, we're going to sing this last song together. I love this song because it just talks about we don't need to live in slavery. No. We don't need to be living as slaves. No. To anyone. Right? To anyone. So, those of you that are watching us on Facebook Live, thanks for joining us tonight. We love our Facebook audience. And I hope that I see you guys this next week. If you guys want to give towards us, there's lots of different ways to do that. Please give as generously as you can. This time of year, our needs go like way, way up here. Because we're taking care of a lot of people. And so if you could be generous, there's 3 ways to do that. You can read on the description there. But thanks again. We love you guys. Let's